Okay, well, welcome to today's ERI seminar. I'm Charles Lee. I'm the director of the Environmental Institute at the University of Waikato. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Nicholas Pinter from the University of California, Davis. Professor Pinter is a professor of applied geosciences, and he's the associate director of the Center for Watershed Sciences. And he's going to talk to us today about managed retreat, which is a topic that attracts interest from a broad spectrum of disciplines.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Thanks to all of you. I understand it's your summer break. Apologies for interrupting that. I'm looking forward to all the conversations today, tomorrow. Just to let you know a little bit where I come from, so Charles mentioned. So I'm part of the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis. And this is across the street from our geology department, Earth and Planetary Sciences. But the center is where an awful lot of interdisciplinary research happens. So I'm a geoscientist. I work with engineers there, ecologists, economists, and many others. That particular area of research is focused on all things water. The other thing that we do there is we proudly embrace applied research. So theoretical water research is wonderful, but we work a lot. We are 20 minutes from the California state capital, Sacramento, and we engage extensively, including right now. We can talk about my group's project with Sacramento, but we enjoy that and are proud of that applied research characteristic. The other thing that we do at the center is that we teach and do research in field sciences and try as much as possible to do it in the field. So this is one of our field trips. So I think 8 times now we've taken groups of mostly graduate students and VIP guests on rafts. It's nearly 3 weeks from the beginning of the trip to the end. This is down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. This is our so-called eco-geo trip. So I'm hoping this is also another point of collaboration that we can discuss the next couple of days. It's very easy for us to organize and run these kind of trips. In North America, it's much harder to do it here, so perhaps there's some mutual benefit. So we've done this a number of times. We had our students in Idaho, the Salmon River, last June. Prior to that was sea kayaking in the Sea of Cortez, Mexico, and we are going to the Salish Sea, that is the San Juan Islands in British Columbia, northwestern U.S. next June. But, please.
It's not broadcasting. It's not broadcasting the screen. If we can. I'm not getting the wrong.
The Grand Canyon.
Yeah,
Sure. Next to me.
the red side of the Grand Canyon. I have a team. No, they don't. They have their own, but the rest of the world uses 1 to 6.
You have to do. No. You have to go. You have to click it in, Josh. You can't just.
Yeah.
You have to enable it for Teams. There you go.
It's got hard to actually get.
This is a very simple.
It's using Teams. If you did quit and reopen, it should be fine. It won't work until you so thinking of this to be
Just quit and reopen. It's okay. Yeah.
Apologies.
Well, perhaps
probably very important we do that specific tree.
You know you should.
Okay.
Josh, I think you have to leave Nicholas through the teams.
Charlie,
Oh, you're moving to Juliana. Ah, that's brilliant.
well, you missed a great seminar yesterday when you were at your meeting.
Oh, he's up there.
Horrible day.
Okay, Josh.
You've done it. Okay.
But I was that scale.
So that's back into Teams.
Sorry about that.
Share.
It's not based on
Allow.
Just look at the
Screen. Josh.
Just mute the microphone here.
I didn't point out.
Okay.
Just tried to get an answer my fish tank a few years ago. Here.
With this. So we were talking about UC Davis, but now let's pivot back to managed retreat. Again, there was a long talk, awful long, too many words. This is really about what has been called managed retreat. And I understand this is being discussed in New Zealand, but just a little bit of background. This is widely described as originating in discussions originally in the UK in the area of coastal protection. And the general idea is this originated managed realignment as an alternative to engineering solutions to coastal erosion, rising sea levels. Sometimes today what we call more about design with nature or working with nature as here. So this is, again, it's an alternative to hard engineering protections. This discussion has evolved into a broader area of adaptation to climate change. So this is the very nice formulation published by Mach and Siders, where they see retreat here as one of several different adaptation pathways, in this case, to rising sea level. So I like to share this as very elegant framing. Here is the much less elegant framing. I show it just because it's my own. So there's a lot going on here, too much. But just to say that there are many other related fields of study and application here that we need to be aware of. So the whole yellow field is engineering, coastal and river engineering protections, and other fields. So my students do not work in population migration, displacement, resettlement, but this is a whole area of research, sociology, and history to be aware of. So for example, we sat down a couple of years ago with the UN Migration Agency, and they are aware of climate and disaster related retreat. But they said that's simply not on their radar at the time because they were coping with 2.5 million refugees out of the Ukraine in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion. So this is related, right? It's just a different proximal cause for the migration and solutions. So my own students and I work in the sort of the Venn diagram, the overlap between managed retreat and hazard mitigation. So we take a very pragmatic view of this field. We work with our U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency while it still exists. That's another topic of discussion. We work with our state of California agency partners as well. And it's really very practically focused on people either at risk of mostly flooding or recently catastrophically flooded and how to reduce that hazard, that risk, future losses into the future. So this has become of great interest broadly for clear reasons. So within the United States alone is estimated by the year 2100, nearly 500 coastal communities, an estimated 4.2 million residents may face regular increase amplified flooding. This is mostly as a result of sea level rise, but also climate-driven and continuing flooding on our river systems. So we have continued to be hydrologists and earth scientists, but also historians in this research. So we think the most telling takeaway in some of this, in particular in the US, is that we have a long history of what is now called managed retreat. So we've identified at least 25 different communities that have moved away. This is mostly from riverine flooding, but also we'll take you through some coastal hazard examples as well. This represents, this says millions, it's actually hundreds of millions of US dollars of taxpayer investment in moving away from flood hazard. And these are hard-won lessons. Some of the case studies I'm going to talk about today, there are successes in that portfolio, but there are also failures. And there's important lessons to be learned from when things worked suboptimally, let's say, or not at all. And finally, there is living expertise here. So I took out a couple of slides to talk about Dennis Knobloch, the mayor of Valmeyer, Illinois, who in the aftermath of catastrophic flooding led the relocation off of the floodplain there. And you can go knock on Dennis's door today, and he's happy to tell you all about their experience. There's the relocation manager of Gazewood Mills, Wisconsin, about Grantham, Australia. And those people are available and represent a source of invaluable expertise if you're planning something like this in the future. So just really quickly, we have about a half a dozen papers. Here's two of them. I have PDFs of all of these. We ran a summit this was in partnership with our U.S. National Academy of Sciences. This was mostly targeted the international diplomatic community and international aid communities based in Washington, D.C. This was a couple of years ago, just to talk about these different lessons and their applicability to other places around the world. I'm going to take you through a little bit of this history and some of the lessons embedded in that history. So the first, I would call it large scale, medium scale relocation in U.S. history, well documented, was 1881 Niobrara, Nebraska. So this is on the banks of the Missouri River, very large tributary to our main stem Mississippi River. This was a community in 1880 of under 500 people, but by local standards, that was a major center. So just a list, I think this has more businesses than maybe my own hometown, or at least comparable. We don't have a harness shop, nor blacksmiths anymore, I think, but something like 5 hotels. This is comparable. This was a major center at the time until the Missouri River rose up out of its banks and inundated the town. This was 2 to 3 meters of water through the downtown. And the residents at the time said, well, this is unacceptable. We never want to go through this again. And they made the conscious decision to move the town up the hill. So if you look at some of the pictures on the right, what that meant in the late 19th century is actually jacking many of the structures up onto wheels or wooden rollers and then pulling them by horse or oxen. It's about 1 kilometer up the hill to the site of the new town, where it grew over about the next 80 to 90 years. Again, this is a smaller Midwestern town, but quite respectable looking. Its own little opera house in the lower right-hand corner. So Niobrara has the dubious distinction of being, I think it's the only town, only large-scale relocation that had to be done twice. So they didn't move far enough. It's complicated, but the town needed to be relocated a second time. So this is a census of every major structure. The bold line is the jurisdiction as it existed in 1970. This was through the leadership, action, and eminent domain of our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They acquired every single property within the jurisdiction of the old town, acquired it, and rebuilt that as the new town that you see as the red dots, still further up the hill. Now, just say by way of epilogue to this particular case study, good thing that they did. So it was 2019, there was major rainfall in the region. It filled one of the tributaries. This is to the Niobrara River, which is the tributary to the Missouri, just to the corner of those maps, overtopped and caused a dam to fail, which sent a wall of water through what was this is Niobrara V2, the intermediate version of the town that would have been completely wiped out, perhaps fatally, in this event had the town not moved. This is a little bit of a scattershot history. We were moving forward to 1937. This is downstream. This is the Ohio River, another major tributary to our Mississippi, and the flood continued on down the main stem Mississippi River as well. This was a milestone event in U.S. history, a really catastrophic flood, affected all floodplain communities. Two of those, Shawneetown, Illinois, and Leavenworth, Indiana, elected to move out of harm's way, move off the floodplain. So Shawneetown was adopted, where did I say? Shawneetown was adopted by what existed at the time as a Federal Works Progress Administration. Leavenworth was adopted by the American Red Cross, which sheltered their populations and moved them to new locations. Shawneetown was moved something like 4 kilometers away, quite substantial. Just so you understand, these are not major cities by modern standards, but these were the centers of these areas. This is Shawneetown, Illinois, right here. The hotel. If you can look in the upper left hand, the ionic columns is the bank. This was the first bank established in the state of Illinois. Major structure downtown in what is now known as Old Shawneetown. And Old Shawneetown basically no longer exists. So you can go there now. The bank still exists. A few trailers still exist, not much. Last time I was in it, the bank, the roof was open to the elements, birds flying in and out. A historic structure. Old Shawneetown is a shadow of the original Shawneetown, and you can go visit New Shawneetown 4 kilometers away. So I'm skipping ahead and want to spend just a minute talking about Odena, Wisconsin. So I thought there might be some interest in this locally, especially giving this talk here in Waikato. So this is sort of an interesting study. We came upon one line in a 1980-ish journal article calling Odena the largest case of managed retreat in U.S. history. And we were surprised by that because we had never heard anything about it. I had no idea. I knew where Wisconsin was, not anything about Odena. We searched further in the literature, and there is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers feasibility study where they rigorously assessed the costs and benefits of relocating this flood-prone town out of the floodplain and concluded that it was not feasible, and the request was declined. So we were surprised then when we went to Google Earth. You could see the grid of the town. This was a town at its heyday of 10,000 people, and there was almost nothing. The Catholic church is there. There was one occupied structure and one recently abandoned residential structure, and that's it. So this is an interesting case study because this is a tribal, has been mostly tribal community, subject to repeated flooding throughout its time, and again, at least called once the largest case of managed retreat in our history. And so we reached out to the tribe, and we gathered a U.S. National Public Radio reporter and said, let's go visit and talk to the community and visit both the old and the new town. So that's available. I'm not going to play it because of time here. You can go in and download this or listen to it if you'd like, stream it. But New Odena exists. Again, this is several miles away from the original site. It was really interesting talking to the tribe. they couch this very much in a unique history of Native Americans in general in that particular tribe, very different perspective. They did not embrace that history, even though it was motivated, self-motivated, and self-led. It was certainly under-resourced. Again, after the initial request for federal government assistance, they did it on their own, and it was, again, sub-optimum, in particular in our interviews with the local residents. Let's move ahead a little bit. 1993 was a milestone year, both hydrologically in the US and in the context of managed retreat. This was our great Midwestern flood, the largest flood of record, cubic feet per second on the river past St. Louis, Missouri, whatever that translates to into cumex. This affected thousands of kilometers of the Missouri, Mississippi, and their tributary rivers. And there were 3 widely cited examples of managed retreat that resulted from this. So really the poster child is the town that I mentioned previously, Valmeyer, Illinois, on the floodplain of the Mississippi River. So this was a town that existed for over a century. It was along the railroad tracks on the Illinois side of the river. And again, this was something like 1,000 people. I think the number comes up in just a minute. Long history, high school, commercial downtown, flooded, in this case, deepest depths were something like 7 meters. It was a catastrophic levee or embankment failure that sent a wall of water into town, destroying most of the structures, the school and the commercial downtown, arguably irreplaceably. So the community members gathered up in the wake of this, met with state and national leaders and said, we just can't go through this again. So they took what was the original town, and this is all voluntary property acquisitions. So unlike the eminent domain in Odena a couple decades earlier, that willing landowners sold and participated in a land swap to acquire property up in New Valmeyer. It's about 100 meters higher in elevation. You go to Old Valmeyer in the upper right-hand side, those light blue or aquamarine dots, there are still a smattering of old structures down there on the floodplain. But the center of town, the new school, the churches are up on the bluffs. There is an annual pilgrimage, so 4th of July, big American holiday, people return. The parade is down in Old Valmeyer. The cemetery is still down there. So there's long-term historical ties to the old town site. But really, people live, do business, mostly up in New Valmeyer. And so if you look at the papers here, what we're very happy to get from Dennis, the mayor, is they kept very detailed records of the cost. So this is different sources of funding. We could talk about this. This is federal and state funding in our system. And by most standards, a relatively modest price tag compared to other more recent projects that I'll mention. So there were a couple of these, but I just wanted to mention one other 1993 relocation. This is Pattonsburg, Missouri, also catastrophically flooded, actually twice in that summer. Smaller than Valmeyer, population of just over 400 at the time, flooded twice, but also 33 times previous to 1993. So we asked the people, what was different in 93 that made you decide to actually do something transformative to address this hazard? And it was a couple things. So mitigation of hazard, a flood hazard in particular, was in widespread discussion in the 1990s. But also it was the 1-2 punch, we call it, 2 flooding events in the summer of 93. Then after the first flood event, they were already new drywall was going in. They had rewired the electrical in many buildings when they got hit a second time. And that made it clear that this was just not a tenable position for most of the residents and the town leaders. So again, a smattering of houses were left, but then the new town reconstructed up on the bluffs. The old town, our federal funding for this is that it would acquire damaged properties, but the land underneath them must be then deeded into permanent open space. You can't leave the structures or resell them. So just an interesting epilogue to this particular case study is then in 1995, just as this process, the old downtown was really being abandoned. the town was approached by a movie director, Ang Lee, who was in the process of finding sets for a Civil War adventure movie. And you can rent it. We have a copy at home, Ride with the Devil. And when you see the grand climactic scene of them burning down, the raiders burning down the downtown, that is flood ravaged but abandoned Pattonsburg being raised just for your entertainment. So that's basically the epilogue for this, except that, unsurprisingly, after being flooded 33 times before, it has been flooded since then, for example, quite badly in 2017. And the couple of remaining houses, some of them moved after this. But again, this would have been yet another severe and damaging flood had they not retreated from this location. In the interest of time here, I'm going to just mention a couple more recent examples, not all. Grundy, Virginia, and Martin, Tennessee were both flooded in, I should know this, the late 2000s. And they have well-connected U.S. congressional delegations who brought in federal dollars and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers expertise and did, this is relatively small scale retreat and reconstruction. In Grundy, they developed a 16-acre commercial parcel, whatever that is in hectares, to the tune, that alone was $300 million in U.S. federal investment to build basically a giant Walmart superstore on stilts. People are pretty cagey about the total cost of these projects. We talked to the local developer and planning officials. It's at least $600 million US dollars, and similar levels from the tiny community of Martin, leading to the current situation, which has been characterized like this: retreat in the U.S. has become a deprioritized, politically perilous option. Same thing in California, even progressive California, very, very perilous. If you've heard about recent examples of retreat in the U.S., maybe you've heard about Ile de Jean Charles, they pronounce it. This is another Native American community in the Mississippi River Delta area, which was rapidly, very rapidly disappearing, mostly due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. A dwindling number of communities. They won the NDCR, is the National Disaster Resilience Competition. It was $52 million from the federal government plus support from the state of Louisiana to relocate to a new site. If you followed the press on this, this has been extremely contentious, although it has moved forward. And similarly, there are at least a dozen predominantly Native American communities in Arctic Alaska disappearing from, this is sea level rise, warming and permafrost melting and coastal erosion, literally falling into the ocean. At least a dozen of these communities seeking relocation. A couple of these are now in progress. I haven't been up there. The press has been relatively negative recently. These are at best problematic. And again, in multiple stages of activity and planning. So I just wanted to mention, these are issues around the world. The US surprisingly has a relatively large number of these, but a couple others. So I managed to connect after the fact with the people involved in the relocation of Grantham, Australia. This is Queensland, right? So this was catastrophically hit by, this was quite fatal flooding, more than 20 people killed in 2011. And the local town council decided never again, so they organized a relocation effort. Jamie Simmons was the American-born relocation manager. The mayor brought him into the site. And we subsequently brought Jamie to the US and toured some of the communities there. I remember sitting in Evansville, Indiana after that tour and saying, Jamie, you have amazing expertise in this. And he said, yeah, that's true. Maybe you should write this all down and sort of make permanent that record. And he sort of rubbed his chin. And then within 6 months, he sent me the manuscript of his book. So it's wonderful this is available. And Jamie's become involves subsequently return to managed retreat. Lethal Australia is right now in the midst of a large-scale buyout and relocation. Anyway, so this stuff goes on in various places. Some of this Australia were, again, Grantham was a tiny community. We were asked, how do you scale that up? So here's Sydney, Australia, facing sea level rise and continued coastal storms and impacts. And it's just unimaginable that you could do something like implement it in Grantham. Just, unfathomable the resources required, the political will. So impossible, except. So the answer to that question is sometimes not look to Australia, but look, for example, to Japan. So we've been working a little bit, published a couple of papers in Japan. Here is one community in northeastern Honshu as it existed in 2006 and as it existed in March 2011. So as you're well aware, what happened in between was this, which was a great earthquake and tsunami, which just devastated the coastline. Long story short, this was just raised. Japan decided that at least in the tsunami affected area, no residential use would be allowed within the high hazard tsunami zone. They pulled back massively from the coastline. They rebuilt residences and whole new towns, small cities indeed, up out of harm's way. Visiting these are commercial centers, new schools, new train stations, new train tracks to accommodate the population, new infrastructure. The Japanese do infrastructure extremely well, but at massive cost. So they had to create a national income tax supplement to fund this, as well as some of the coastal protections in the wake of this. So I want to pivot just a little bit. I don't know exactly who's in the room. I look forward to these discussions, but I was asked to give this talk recently at a stream ecology meeting. And so I was asked the question, how do you connect those things, right? So we have a general sense, there's some kind of overlap here, but as we thought about it, there's actually a lot. So if any of you are interested in this stuff, that the space obviously overlaps. We want the outcomes. If you're a stream ecologist, you would love to see riparian habitat open back up. Room for the river is widely discussed today. Nature-based solutions have benefits for both of these areas. So this kind of worked, and sadly the outcome of this is that I got signed up to write a paper on this in the next couple of months. But I think this is a good thing, right? There's a lot of synergism here. So if that wasn't far enough afield for you, let's see, did anyone know the reference here?
Monty Python.
Monty Python, thank you. Thank you. I showed this to my students. What's this one? Now for something completely different. So we have most recently been working in Iceland. And Iceland has floods, it has great big glacial outburst floods, but that's actually not what we're working on. Working on is volcanic hazard. So I thought coming to New Zealand, I have to give myself a few minutes at least to talk about Grindavik, maybe Vestmannaeyjar, and the Sundanuko-Digar eruptions that have been occurring for the last couple of years. So just to orient you, so we've thrown the stream ecologists a bone, the geoscientists, and everyone else, like social scientists. I think you'll see there's a lot in common in these issues. So this is the Reykjanes Peninsula. You see Reykjavik, the capital, in the upper right. If you've flown in, Keflavik, the international airport, is the far northwestern tip of the peninsula. There's a geological map here. So the early Viking settlers experienced the previous eruptive phase in the 12th century. It's been quiet now for 800 years until 2021. So renewed eruption here. So this is actually video we shot. My daughter shot this. There's some interesting audio that accompanies this. So this is called the tourist-friendly eruption. So after they figured out what's going on here, an estimated 450,000 local and international visitors climbed up the ridge, and you could sort of look down to the active. This is a fissure eruption, but with a couple of loci of effusive activity. You can actually look at this coming out in 2021. You see the shaded area of where that flowed. 2022, 2023, we had students there. It was just a little too far to take everyone, disappointing for all those geology students. So this was all pretty benign because it was remote. That changed 2023 when the locus of activity shifted to the west and fissures opened up in more populated areas. So what you're seeing here is lava flowing immediately adjacent to a large geothermal facility, which is most of the steam, and the ponds you're seeing there are Blue Lagoon. So this would have covered the Blue Lagoon had there not been interventions that we'll talk about very quickly. In addition, in the opposite direction, lava flowed actively towards the community of Grindavik. So this is 4,000 people, which again, by small, by New Zealand, certainly by US standards, but this is 1% of the national population of Iceland, imminently threatened by this. The way this developed, it's a shame there's not the audio for this, but this is colleagues of ours in Grindavik. It began with seismic activity, culminating on November 11 of 2023, what has been described as nonstop earthquake activity. The whole house is shaking here, and resulting in the evacuation of the town. As we'll talk about, it has remained essentially empty, all but a couple dozen households in the subsequent 2 years. Actually, most of the damage, so if you visited Grindavik then as an emergency responder or now as a tourist, you can go in, most of the damage was due to rifting. So this is actually the plate boundary. This is the active plate boundary today. The town is pulled apart, something like 60 structures slated for demolition imminently right now. So our group, including Icelandic scientists, me, geoscientists, anthropologists, were asked to go in. We interviewed something like 25 different residents, talked with government officials up to the parliament level in the context of learning lessons for managed retreat. So there's a lot going on here. This is episodic eruption. The yellow line is that big earthquake swarm and the evacuation of the town in November of 23. There have been, I think we're at 10 different eruptive episodes right now. The lava has pushed again towards the geothermal and spa facility and multiple times towards the town. Just mention really quickly, one of the things we learned, we were here in January of this year, is that you don't understand disaster response in Iceland, particularly Grindavik today, unless you remember what happened in Vestmannaeyjar, otherwise known as Jaime Island in 1973. So this was literally the cover of my freshman geology textbook. In January of 1973, almost without warning, a new rift opened on Jaime Island. Similar sized community, 5,200 residents were evacuated within 18 hours. So almost without warning, this new rift unzipped beneath the town, was showering it with ash and eventually flowing lava. So we went in July of this year. So Gudrun is one of our Icelandic colleagues, and we interviewed and toured the island with Palk Dofoniasson. Icelandic pronunciation is challenging. So as a 20-something newly graduated engineer, he had just been hired as the city engineer for the city of Vestmannaeyjar. He was woken up in the middle of the night, his wife calling, saying that the whole sky was lit up with what turned out to be fountains of lava. First priority is to get his young family on the fishing fleet and out of town. Next was to drive his vehicle to the new rift, which he described literally unzipping in front of the car. And then over this next 6 months, dealing with this incredible disaster unfolding not only in Iceland, but the world watching at the time. So really quickly, this has become sort of the poster child of what has been called the control of nature, spraying seawater to redirect and attempt to halt the lava flow, in particular to keep Vestmannaeyjar's harbor open. It is the major topic So John McPhee is the leading, was at a time, everyone read John McPhee's work. His leading work is this book, The Control of Nature, which is mostly about Vespaneer and a couple of other examples of this control of nature. A great victory for humans and engineers in particular. So 50 years later, almost exactly, Iceland responds to the Sundanukur-Giger, the current eruptive sequence, very much with this previous paradigm. So like then, they start first of all by mobilizing their engineers. They constructed a series of lava barriers now over 14 kilometers high, in places more than 14 kilometers long, over 25 meters high. They've had to raise them multiple times, often literally driving the tractors over molten material to get ahead of the threats. The barrier has been mostly successful, except a couple of times. So in January of 2014, the rift actually opened up underneath the Grindavik barrier on the town side, and lava, you see it coming out, flowed underneath, erupted underneath, and into town, and destroyed 3 structures. So 3 houses destroyed. All the other damage is rifting, fissure related. The other part of this is really a social challenge. So again, this is 4,000 people, 1% of Iceland's population displaced. This is a major commercial hub. It is the second largest, the harbor brings in the second largest fisheries catch in the country, but in particular the residents. The Icelandic government looked to 1% of the population paying mortgages on homes that were uninhabitable and have remained essentially uninhabitable for the last 2 years. And they decided first to support them. So for more than a year, there were generous social supports for education, rental support, business subsidies, counselors were deployed. And here we go. They established Thorkatla, which is a government-chartered private corporation that has now, long story short, bought out almost every owner-occupied residential structure in the town. So it's now just shy of 1,000 structures that the residents have sold to Thorkatla, basically to the government, with the goal of providing short-term relief for those residents. It was never intended to be a case of managed retreat or even permanent evacuation. So just a couple of quotes from the interviews. So throw some cat food or dog food on the ground and hope for the best. And that was, 2 days worth of cat food from what has now been a more than 2-year evacuation. So again, the problem is just this has lasted really, really long. So they just passed the 2-year anniversary. They were expecting another Vespaneer, 6 months at the most. This is a little bit old, but what everyone has learned to watch is the permanent GPS station. So once again, the magma chamber is inflating. The next eruptive phase is imminent. When we were there in July, it erupted literally 6 hours after I left. Flew out, which is tragic for geoscientists. Absolutely tragic. The seismicity continues all along this chain. So again, long story short, people thought that they would be back there in days. We just passed the 2-year anniversary. Thorkatla is paying the interest on, this is 2/3 of $1 billion US. They're heating the homes, maintaining the homes. Their whole business model is to get people back, to have people, the original owners, repurchase the homes in short order. That is not coming together. Our interviews suggested what Thorkatla and the Icelandic government does not want to hear, is that many of them didn't want to return in the immediate aftermath. A diminishing number are actually ever planning to go back. So I'll just kind of end on this because I'm out of time. We started talking about managed retreat. I think there's a lot to be learned from this. We've also, by the way, looked at town relocations associated with mining. So the one in Sweden, we visited there. It'll come to me later. Really widespread lessons. If you're looking for conclusions, you're not going to get them. This one at least Grindavik is still an evolving story. So all you can ask are questions. So one is geological, right? So when is the immediate proximal hazard going to end? And we don't know the answer to that. So about 2 months ago, the Grindavik Council said that it would be reopening daycare centers this January, so imminently, and all the public schools next fall term, Northern Hemisphere fall, so next August, September. Their hope is that that will be the trigger they need to get people back, of which basically no one has come back yet. There's, again, a couple dozen people who have continued to live there, otherwise not. But this is just a little bit of my interpretation. Things have changed a lot since 1973. So that was still 50s, 60s, early 70s. There was this engineering ethos that we can fix anything, right? And we're proud of that. So that was in control of nature. It's a very different picture now. So really, although these lava barriers have been largely successful in Iceland over the last couple of years, what really stands out, both in terms of investment and the novelty and the innovation needed, has been the social response. However, I didn't put this in here because the Icelanders get very upset when we give our own interpretation of this. So I would suggest to you, not written down here, although I guess we're being recorded, that the very generosity of the Icelandic government in the immediate aftermath, giving people, untethering them from this community, giving them resources to buy new homes, to enroll their children in new schools, really undermines the original plan of this being a short-term evacuation, and has really turned this into much more of a case of managed retreat. Volcanic, but again, part of the overall picture of adapting, responding to hazards in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions in the room for Professor Fletcher?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, kia ora. I just had a comment as well on that last point. I think it really relates to one of our case studies here in Aotearoa, where the extended uncertainty for people, along with that assistance for them to detach from place, has been a real enabler for people to see managed retreat as a viable option. We had that similar situation in Aotearoa where managed retreat was considered, but people actually chose to have a retreat happening immediately rather than in the future because they just wanted the certainty. And so I think there's some interesting links between some of these case studies around that, the human need for certainty as well as all of the other things that they need for financial security. And I think that's an interesting alignment that we can see in some of these case studies.
So I'm so interested to learn more about what's going on in New Zealand right now. What I can tell you is we've asked, what is the long-term outcome?
Yeah.
And so some of these histories go back decades or longer, right? So one of our papers, if you're interested, we looked at, to the extent you can measure the viability of the community, we looked at population, economic activity in towns that had moved, compared them with comparable examples across the US Midwest. And it feels like what happened then is the retreat sort of took away this fear, this constant downward spiral in the face of ongoing flood risk, and allowed them to grow and thrive in ways they couldn't, sitting on the floodplain, being flooded every couple of years.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. So Henry from the Waikato Regional Council. Did you find in the community you talked to anyone who decided to retreat, but it wasn't the result of a natural hazards event aftermath?
So good question. If you're hearing it, has anyone proactively retreated? And the answer is no, not one example that I've worked with. That more commonly, almost all of them have been after a major flood or coastal storm, and more. Widespread damage. The examples that were really because that was the second coastal storm here, and they had once rebuilt only to be damaged again. for us to motivate this kind of a transformation?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. I was curious in your example. So towards the end there, talking about Iceland, there was an awful lot of data available, an awful lot of observations, and yet that seemed to be the place where they were trying to push the people back, as opposed to previous examples where there wasn't data available, where they weren't where people were happy to just pick up sticks and move. Do you think there's something in that in terms of so much data we think we can somehow return?
So Iceland is different than New Zealand, is different than the Midwest. You are absolutely right that the local stakeholders, not the residents, but the town council, the Icelandic government, and Thorkatla want to return. And to a geoscientist, that sounds unwise, but we have in sympathy asked the questions, where in Iceland and where in the Reykjanes Peninsula in particular do you move that is 100% safe? And so it is challenging. I'd suggest there are safer spots. Even prior to this, you could see the rifts where previously this had ripped apart, again, spreading between North American plate and Europe. Iceland historically has suffered from a wide range of disasters. These are avalanches in the north, fatal avalanches, glacial outbursts, floods, coastal storms. I think what you're seeing is a little bit of a sociological shift where new standard of living there means we've become much more entrenched in our current positions, and just shifting in response to these different hazards has just become much more difficult.
Thanks. You mentioned sort of throughout your presentation, this history of different examples of managed retreat, and you mentioned that some of them were maybe more successful than others. So I was just curious to hear like how you kind of define success in this context, and also like whether you've identified any key variables or key things that kind of determine whether it's a success or not.
How do you define the success of a relocation? We've struggled, and I prefer to dodge that question, but I'll do my best here. We don't know, but maybe you recognize success when you see it. I'll just point out by example, anecdotally. So Valmeyer is extremely proud of their relocation. So you go there, and the former mayor, the residents are happy to sit down and talk to you about what worked well and how they did it. So other places have mixed feelings. Pattonsburg, they made a new school. It's a great big dome, and all the classrooms are slices of the pie. And the residents look at this thing and say, what were we thinking in 1993? And then there's places where they look back and say, why did we do this? So we have ideas, except to say that I think everyone should look at the wide variety of experience out there. I would not be willing to go beyond anecdote and define success for those people. More likely to defer to the people who experienced it firsthand, what their recollection is.
So go to 3 because they've been up there for a while. So the first question is from Rob Bell. How much has national flood insurance delayed relocation from very vulnerable floodplains?
Okay, so that's part of what I'm here to talk about in New Zealand and think about. So we have a national flood insurance program in the US. You have a natural disaster insurance program. And there is widespread discussion in the US that perhaps the national flood insurance program has enabled not just continued occupation of the floodplain, but continued growth onto the floodplain. And certainly the latter and probably the former as well. I won't speak to your experience, but the National Flood Insurance Program is blind. Our National Flood Insurance Program is blind to climate change. It allows growth into areas just the right side of the line, where certainly in a climate-aware framework that wouldn't be allowed. And those places anecdotally have been flooded subsequently. We are trying to address the issue of people in the floodplain who are repeatedly flooded, staying there against all seeming common sense. So our gradually hard-won lessons, our National Flood Insurance Program has instituted triggers. Any given property in any given flood, if it is damaged, 50% or more must be removed or mitigated. That is not widely enforced. A number of different flood claims were paid at the 49% level again and again and again until FEMA administrators realized this was a problem and now say that it is a cumulative measure of damage. As soon as it can be 49% and then 2% in the next flood, and you should mitigate or relocate. So it is absolutely an issue, whoever asked the question, and we are wrestling with it and trying to at least improve our response to that challenge.
Okay, the next question is from Chris Eager. How do things like magnitude, frequency, and certainty of future disaster factor into decisions of residents to retreat?
Okay. So, I mean, it's certainly, that awareness is certainly in there. And at least in the US, I can tell you that having residents aware of the flood risk in their community is already a success. So there's like colleagues at University of California, Berkeley have surveyed residents behind levees, large flood control embankments in California, who are completely unaware that they live on a natural floodplain and are subject to perhaps catastrophic failure of those levees. So unawareness is certainly an added challenge to all of this. Living history, I think this is a psychological question, right? So living history. So if you experienced some subset of 33 floods in your lifetime, you should be aware, and hopefully at some point that statistic should factor into your decision whether to stay there or not. Conversely, if you have never experienced a flood, the threat of one is theoretical and probably not very motivational. And oftentimes the records do not match the oral history of psychology. So there was fatal flooding in the Texas Hill Country just this last summer. And some of the news reporting after that said this is the first time it's ever flooded like this on those streams. That's not true. I was there in 2013, I believe. Just the next drainage over had done the same thing. The water levels rise 15 meters in a matter of hours. It's just insane. So people's own history and memory, however faulty, absolutely is wrapped up in their decisions.
One last question from online. So this is Akuhata Bailey Winiata. How have the communities maintained connection to place that they have located away from? In Aotearoa, New Zealand, with Maori communities, land and place are important to cultural identity. Any insights?
So a lot of sympathy with that connection to place. And we see it even in the US as a young society, supposedly mobile, and yet people have this intense connection and sense of identity. So Valmeyer, one of the options that they considered after this catastrophic flooding was to become absorbed by the next nearest community. In fact, we've talked about economically, many of these communities have been shrinking through most of the 20th century in the central US. That would make a certain sense, but it was absolutely anathema. They were not willing to make that decision. They, as a group, had connections with their own community, as well as connections with the place that it occupied. But the place was untenable. They were unwilling to subject their people to that same hazard. So one of the positives, I would suggest, of managed retreat is it transplants that community to a new location. In the case of Valmeyer, much of what held that community together were their churches. So the first things to be rebuilt were the churches, and that exists now in the new location. They speak fondly of the old commercial center downtown. That was one thing that was not transplanted well, and they rue that loss. But they are in a new place. They are still Valmeyer. They trace back to the original founding of the town. They return there. We've been there for the parade. We have video of that. It's on the university website. I think much of that can be maintained in safer environments.
Thank you. We'll go to one last question in the room. Julia?
In Grindavik, the question is why is Thorkatla paying to maintain? Because if you don't heat the houses in Iceland, they're rapidly uninhabitable forever. So, and it's actually cheap. It's just piping in geothermal water. But yeah, it's this huge challenge. Again, Thorkatla, it's a real estate company. They are floating this huge debt with the anticipation that they'll resell all these residences. They hope to the original owners. Between us, that's not going to happen. Maybe someone else in the future, maybe.
So we have one last question from online. Sorry, because this person got a lot of thumbs up. So Barbara Hammonds asked a question. We've had farms and horticultural land massively affected by flooding, exacerbated by forestry slash as around Gisborne recently. Do you have examples of how managed retreat operates for rural people?
Interesting question. So thank you for the question. I hadn't thought about that before. In my experience, most of the academic attention as well as the governmental attention is focused on population centers. There are individual buyouts. So for the US, it's not like we have funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency for buyouts of flood-prone or flood-affected structures. That is certainly applicable to individual rural homes. There has been discussion about, for example, non-residential farm structures. It is often not feasible to relocate them because they have to be in proximity to where the actual agriculture is occurring. And the answer to that is, for better or for worse, it's an engineering solution. So you have to flood-proof those structures. And again, more credit to engineers. They have a toolkit that is sometimes appropriate. It doesn't always have to be a wholesale relocation. You have to adapt. And in most cases, realistically, most solutions to both riverine flooding and coastal flooding are engineering solutions. Sometimes, however, managed retreat is a viable and even cost-effective option.
I think we'll conclude the seminar today at this time. Thank you all for attending, both in person and online. Could you join me in another round of applause for Professor Pinter?
Thanks, Nicholas. Just a very small token of our appreciation and something to remember us by. But we hope that actually what you've experienced in all of those questions shows us we actually share a deep affinity for these issues and these problems. And clearly there's something we can do together here in developing this. I think the other thing you showed us, which is really important to us right now, and no doubt in the United States as well, is the real importance of bringing together the humanities and the social sciences with the physical sciences, because that's where we will come up with some solutions and really help humanity save themselves, if you like. So again, thank you very much. A good lecture, a lot for us to think about. Thank you.